The auctioneer paused at $1,859,880, looked across the ring at Marcus Tilden's raised paddle, and waited a beat longer than usual before calling for a higher number. The crowd had gone quiet enough by then that the wind moving through the open sale tent was the loudest thing in the field. Tilden didn't move. Walt Sorensen, standing near the back of the crowd in the same canvas coat he'd worn to every farm sale in Wright County, Minnesota, for the better part of 50 years, raised his paddle one more time and made the mistake, as far as half the room was concerned, of thinking he could actually win. He could. The hammer came down on $1,860,000 a few seconds later, and Walt Sorensen, 74 years old, had just outbid a land developer by $120 for 240 acres everybody in that crowd had assumed 20 minutes earlier belonged to whoever Tilden decided he wanted it to belong to. This is the kind of story my father would have told slow, at his own kitchen table, with all the names left in. If yours did too, this channel is built for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. The land in question had belonged to Arvid Lindqvist, who farmed it alone for 60-some years after his own father passed it down, and who died that February at 91 with no children and a nephew in Arizona who'd never once expressed any interest in farming Minnesota dirt. Arvid had kept an old International Harvester combine running well past the point most men would have traded it in, telling anybody who asked that a machine paid for in full owed him nothing further in the way of looking modern. The estate put the 240 acres up for auction in May. Prime ground along the highway frontage on the edge of Monticello, the kind of parcel that draws both working farmers and developers to the same gravel lot, usually for entirely different reasons. The sale tent went up in the same farmyard Arvid had walked every morning of his adult life. Folding chairs lined up 8 to a row, the spring mud still soft enough in places to pull at a person's boots. Hessel Brunner, who'd run the township's only remaining diner for going on 30 years, and fed half the crowd breakfast before most farm sales in that part of the county, told customers that morning she figured the Lindqvist place would go to whoever wanted it worst rather than whoever could simply afford it most. A distinction she'd watched proved true more than once over the years. Marcus Tilden had bought 4 other farms in that township over the previous 3 years, each one eventually turning into a subdivision with a name like Hamlet Creek Estates or Whispering Oaks. Names that didn't have much to do with anything that had ever actually grown on that ground. He'd closed every one of those 4 deals without much of a fight. The sellers mostly elderly, mostly without family interested in farming, mostly relieved to take a number considerably higher than what the land would have brought from another farmer. He showed up to the Lindqvist sale in a clean pickup with a folder of comparable sales tucked under his arm, and bid on the parcel the same unhurried way he'd bid on the other 4, confident the numbers would eventually do what they'd always done before. Walt had watched what those 4 subdivisions had done to the farmers who still worked ground nearby. Drainage tile disrupted by new storm sewer systems, county assessments climbing on land that hadn't changed a bit in its own use. Complaints filed against perfectly ordinary grain dryers running late into an October night. He didn't relish the idea of watching the same thing happen along his own north fence line, and Doris had understood that better than almost anybody, which was most of why she'd started the fund in the first place, rather than simply telling him to hope for the best. Walt Sorensen farmed the 600 acres directly south of the Lindqvist place. Ground his own grandfather had broken with a team of horses in 1911, the same year, as it happened, the Lindqvist family had first taken title to the section north of it. The 2 farms had shared a fence line for over a century. 2 families who'd helped each other through droughts and wet springs and at least one bad fire in the 1960s, without either one ever once trying to buy the other out. A kind of neighborliness, Walt figured, was getting rarer by the year in that part of the county. He had spent the better part of 10 years quietly preparing for a morning exactly like this one. His wife, Doris, had been the one to first say it out loud back in 2015, sitting at their kitchen table, going over the numbers on a piece of back acreage that wasn't pulling its weight. "Ground don't come up twice," she told him, dropping the article the way she did most evenings when she was tired and didn't have patience left for extra words. "Sell the 95 acres now. Bank it. Because Arvid isn't getting any younger." Walt had argued with her for the better part of a week before admitting she was right, the same way most arguments between them had eventually gone in their 41 years of marriage. She wasn't always right, exactly. She was right often enough that arguing past the first week rarely paid off. Doris died in 2019, breast cancer that moved faster than anybody expected once it was finally caught, and Walt kept building the fund anyway, the same patient way she'd started it. Adding to it, every year the operation turned a decent profit, never quite telling himself exactly what he was waiting for, even though he knew. By the morning of the Lindqvist sale, he had $1,860,000 sitting in an account he did not intend to go $1 past, a number Doris had helped him calculate the rough shape of, years before either of them knew exactly when it would matter. A man, too, rose up from Walt, leaned back during the early bidding, and told him, not unkindly, that he might as well save his knees the trouble of standing through the whole thing, since Tilden had outbid better men than Walt on better ground than this. Walt didn't say anything back. He just kept his paddle low and waited. The bidding opened at $4,000 an acre and climbed fast through the working farmers in the crowd, men and women bidding their own real operating capital on ground they actually intended to plant. The kind of bidding that thins out quickly once the number passes what a farm can reasonably pay for itself over time. A young couple from 2 sections over dropped out around $5,200, shaking their heads at each other the way people do when a number has just told them something about their own budget they already half knew. By $6,500 an acre, it was down to 2 paddles, Walt's and Tilden's. Walt watched Tilden's face. He watched Tilden's hand. He watched the particular ease with which Tilden raised his paddle each time. The ease of a man who'd never once had to feel a bid in his own stomach, the way Walt felt every single one of his. The increments slowed to $50 and $100 an acre as the total climbed past $1.5 million. The auctioneer's chant tightening the way it does when both bidders are running close to a number neither one wants to say out loud first. By the time the bidding moved off whole acre increments and onto flat dollar raises near the very top, Tilden's bid stood at $1,859,880, a number that happened to sit exactly at the ceiling his bank had set 3 days earlier, though nobody standing in that crowd had any way of knowing that yet. What Walt didn't know, and what Tilden's own bank had told him 3 days before the sale, was that Tilden's financing on this particular parcel was capped at $1,859,880, a number tied to a loan-to-value calculation Tilden's lender had run against the zoning uncertainty still hanging over that stretch of highway frontage. The county hadn't yet approved a rezoning request Tilden had filed back in March, and until it did, the bank wasn't willing to lend against the land's eventual subdivision value, only its current agricultural value, a considerably more conservative number than Tilden had hoped to work with. Tilden had assumed, walking into the sale that morning, that no working farmer in the county would push the bidding anywhere near a ceiling that tight. Not arrogant, exactly, just a man who'd watched the same math work in his favor 4 times running and had no particular reason yet to expect a 5th outcome any different. He had no particular reason to think otherwise. Walt Sorensen had never once, in 50 years of farm sales, bid past what he could actually pay. The hammer fell. Walt signed the paperwork at the clerk's table with a hand that wasn't shaking nearly as much as he'd expected it to, folded the receipt into his coat pocket, and drove the 240 acres worth of distance back to his own kitchen table that afternoon, in the same Ford pickup he'd owned since before Doris got sick, where he sat alone for a while before calling his daughter to tell her what he'd done. She didn't say much at first, just asked him twice whether he was certain about the number, the way a daughter asks a father something she already half suspects the answer to. He told her the fund had been Doris's idea from the start, and that finishing it felt less like a decision he'd made that morning and more like one the two of them had already made together, a decade earlier, without either of them knowing exactly when it would come due. Marcus Tilden found him at his truck afterward, congratulated him without much visible irritation, and asked, plain, how a farmer had managed to outbid a man with considerably deeper pockets than the whole township put together. Walt told him the pockets weren't the part that mattered. Knowing your own number was. Tilden didn't have much to say back to that. He shook Walt's hand, said he supposed he'd be looking at ground somewhere else in the county, and left. Asked later by a local paper doing a short piece on the sale whether he'd had any idea, going in, that he'd actually win. Walt said he honestly hadn't. He'd known what he could pay. He hadn't known what Tilden could, not until the gavel told him. Walt Sorensen is 75 this year. He planted soybeans on the Lindfist ground that same spring, the first crop that highway frontage had seen in over a year, and the harvest that fall ran close enough to his own neighboring fields that the line between the two farms has mostly stopped meaning anything at all to the men who work it. He left the old fence line standing for the first season out of habit more than necessity, then took it down himself that winter, the same way a man takes down a wall between two rooms he's decided don't need to stay separate anymore. His daughter and son-in-law have started talking, lately, about moving back to help run the combined operation. A conversation that wouldn't have made much practical sense before the Lindfist purchase and now seems, to all three of them, like the obvious next chapter. He keeps the auction receipt in the same kitchen drawer where Doris used to keep the household bills, and he still talks to her out loud sometimes, working that ground, telling her the numbers came out close enough that her math had been right all along, same as it usually was. The man who'd told him to save his knees that morning has since told the story himself at more than one coffee shop table in town, usually ending it the same way, that Tilden had the bigger bankroll and Walt had the better reason. And on that particular morning, the reason turned out to matter more. Hazel Brunner still serves breakfast before every farm sale in the township and still tells customers when the Lindfist sale comes up that she'd had a feeling about it that morning, though she'll admit, if pressed, that she has a feeling about most sales and isn't always right about which way they'll go. Marcus Tilden bought ground 2 townships over that fall instead, a parcel with no neighbor quite so determined sitting on the other side of the fence.